The rain came down in cold sheets across Pennsylvania Avenue, turning the city into a study in gray concrete and black umbrellas. Special Agent Thomas Hartley stood outside the Soviet embassy's residential compound, watching the windows for any flicker of movement. He'd been with the FBI's counterintelligence division for 11 years, long enough to know that espionage was rarely about gunfights or car chases. It was about patience, about noticing what didn't belong. Inside the Bureau's field office on East Street, the atmosphere was tense but controlled. Edgar Hoover had made it clear. Soviet intelligence operations on American soil were to be monitored, documented, and when possible, neutralized. The KGB residenture in Washington operated under diplomatic cover, and everyone knew it. What they didn't always know was how. Hartley's assignment had begun 3 weeks earlier when a routine surveillance team reported unusual activity around the residence of Viktor Petrov, a mid-level Soviet cultural attaché. Petrov was known to the Bureau. His file contained photographs, transcript of intercepted phone calls, and reports from informants who placed him at meetings with known intelligence officers. But Petrov had been careful. Too careful. Agent Hartley. The voice belonged to Robert Lamphere, a veteran counterintelligence officer whose work on the Rosenberg case had made him a legend within the Bureau. Lamphere gestured toward a conference room, where a long table was covered with surveillance photographs. "We got something." The photographs showed Petrov leaving a small Orthodox church in Georgetown. In his hands, a leather-bound Bible. The images captured him on 3 separate occasions over 2 weeks, always carrying the same book, always alone. "Russians don't advertise their faith," Lamphere said quietly, tapping one of the photos. "Not in 1963. Not when Khrushchev's campaign against religion is in full swing. So why is a Soviet diplomat visiting an Orthodox church and carrying a Bible around Washington?" Hartley studied the images. Petrov's face showed no emotion. The practiced neutrality of a trained operative. Could be genuine, could be cover for a meeting, or it could be a signal. Lamphere replied, "We've intercepted coded messages from the embassy, references to the book and the word. We think it's operational." 2 days later, Hartley and a team of FBI technical specialists executed a black bag operation, an illegal but sanctioned break-in, at Petrov's residence while the diplomat attended a reception at the State Department. The operation had been planned with military precision. Entry, search, photograph, exit. No trace left behind. The apartment was sparse, furnished in the utilitarian style common to Soviet diplomatic housing. A small kitchen, a bedroom with a single bed, a living area with a radio and stacks of Russian newspapers. And on the coffee table, centered precisely as a place of display, the Bible. Hartley approached it carefully, pulling on latex gloves. The leather cover was worn but well-maintained, embossed with Cyrillic text. He opened it slowly. The pages were thin, translucent, typical of a mass-produced religious text. The Cyrillic script was dense, unadorned. He flipped through Genesis, Exodus, the Psalms. Nothing appeared unusual. "Bag it," he told the technical specialist, a thin man named Edward Kovac, who'd spent the war years breaking German codes. "We'll take it back to the lab." Kovac placed the Bible in an evidence bag, but hesitated. "Wait." He held the book up to the light, tilting it at an angle. "The weight distribution is wrong. Feel this." Hartley took the Bible back. Kovac was right. The book felt heavier toward the spine, as if something dense had been inserted between the binding and the pages. He ran his fingers along the edge. There, a slight irregularity in the leather, almost imperceptible. "We need X-rays," Kovac said. Back at the FBI laboratory on the 4th floor of the Justice Department building, the Bible was placed under a portable X-ray machine. The technician adjusted the exposure, then developed a film in a darkroom adjacent to the lab. When he emerged 15 minutes later, his expression had changed. "Gentlemen, you need to see this." The X-ray image was unmistakable. Embedded within the hollow cavity carved into the Bible's spine was a cylindrical object approximately 3 inches long and half an inch in diameter. Thin wires extended from it, running between the pages like veins. The device was positioned perfectly to avoid detection by casual inspection, but the X-ray revealed its true nature. "Subminiature microphone," Kovac said, his voice barely above a whisper. Probably Soviet manufacture, battery-powered, transmitting on a VHF frequency. This is state-of-the-art. Hartley felt his pulse quicken. How long has it been active? Impossible to say without opening it. But if I had to guess, weeks, maybe longer. Lamphere arrived within the hour. He studied the X-ray in silence, then looked at Hartley. Where has this Bible been? That question launched the most intensive investigation Hartley had ever conducted. Using surveillance logs, photographic evidence, and human intelligence sources, the FBI began reconstructing the Bible's journey through Washington. What they discovered was chilling. Petrov had not kept the Bible at his residence. Instead, he had systematically placed it in locations where sensitive conversations might occur, and then retrieved it days later. The Orthodox Church in Georgetown had been one stop, but there were others. A refugee assistance office run by a Catholic charity, where Eastern European émigrés discussed their escape routes and contacts in the Soviet Union. The Bible had been left there for 3 days, positioned on a waiting room table. A private study room at Georgetown University's library, reserved by a graduate student who was also a part-time legislative aide to Senator Henry Jackson, a vocal anti-communist and member of the Armed Services Committee. The Bible had been forgotten on a shelf for 2 days. A small cafe near Capitol Hill frequented by congressional staffers. The Bible had been placed on a chair, visible but unremarkable, for an entire afternoon. Each location represented a potential intelligence goldmine. Conversations about defectors, discussions of defense appropriations, casual remarks about congressional travel schedules or committee hearings. All of it captured by the device hidden in a symbol of faith that no one would think to examine. It's brilliant, Lamphere admitted. Who suspects a Bible? Who examines one closely? It's a Trojan horse made of scripture. But Hartley's mind was working through a different problem. If Petrov planted this device, he had to retrieve the recordings. How? Kovac provided the answer after dismantling the Bible under controlled conditions. The device doesn't record. It transmits, short range, but effective within about 200 feet. Someone had to be nearby with a receiver every time the Bible was in position. That meant surveillance, counter-surveillance, a network. Hartley requested every surveillance photograph taken near the locations where the Bible had been placed. The FBI's Technical Services Division delivered boxes of images, hundreds of faces, most of them innocent bystanders. But 3 individuals appear repeatedly, always within range, always carrying briefcases or bags large enough to conceal a radio receiver. 2 were known Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover. The third was an American. His name was Paul Richter, age 47. A signals intelligence analyst for the National Security Agency, stationed at Fort Meade, Maryland. Security clearance. Top secret, with access to SIGINT related to Soviet communications. No prior red flags. A decorated veteran of World War II who'd worked as a radio operator during the Normandy invasion. Hartley felt the case shift beneath him like ice cracking on a frozen lake. "We have a mole," he said. The National Security Agency compound at Fort Meade existed in a state of permanent secrecy. Surrounded by fences, guard towers, and wooded buffer zones, it was where America's most sensitive intelligence operations were conducted. Inside, thousands of analysts worked in windowless rooms, intercepting and decoding Soviet military communications, diplomatic cables, and KGB transmissions. The work was tedious, technical, and absolutely critical to national security. Paul Richter had been part of that machine for 9 years. His colleagues described him as quiet, competent, and unremarkable. The kind of man who arrived on time, completed his assignments without complaint, and rarely socialized. He lived alone in a modest apartment in Laurel, drove a 5-year-old Ford, and attended Lutheran services on Sundays. Nothing about him suggested betrayal, but the FBI surveillance photographs told a different story. Hartley spread the images across the conference table in the FBI's Washington field office. Each photograph had been taken near one of the locations where Petrov's Bible had been placed, and in each one, Paul Richter appeared, sometimes reading a newspaper, sometimes sitting on a bench, always within radio range of the hidden microphone. He's not just receiving the transmissions, Hartley said, addressing the task force assembled for the investigation. He's coordinating with Petrov. This is active espionage. Lamphere leaned forward, his expression grim. Do we know how long he's been compromised? Not yet, but if he's had access to Sigin for 9 years. Hartley didn't need to finish the sentence. The damage could be catastrophic. Every Soviet code the NSA had broken, every communication intercept, every signal intelligence operation, all of it potentially compromised. The decision was made to place Richter under intensive surveillance without alerting him to the investigation. FBI agents followed him to work, monitored his phone calls, photographed everyone he met. The surveillance was delicate work. NSA employees were trained to detect foreign intelligence threats, which made them unusually alert to being watched. For 3 weeks, Richter's routine remained unchanged. He drove to Fort Meade each morning, worked his shift analyzing Soviet naval communications, and returned home each evening. He shopped for groceries on Saturdays. He attended church on Sundays. He made no suspicious contacts, no dead drops, no clandestine meetings. He's clean, one of the surveillance agents reported. Either he's not our guy or he's made us. But Hartley wasn't convinced. Richter's appearance in surveillance photographs was too consistent to be coincidence. There had to be something they were missing. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Richter's trash. FBI technicians conducting a trash cover, collecting and analyzing discarded materials, found fragments of burned paper in Richter's garbage. The fragments were small, charred almost beyond recognition. But the FBI laboratory was able to restore portions of the text using chemical treatments and infrared photography. What emerged was a page from a one-time pad, a cryptographic tool used by Soviet intelligence for unbreakable encryption. Each page contained random number groups that corresponded to letters or words. Once used, the page was supposed to be destroyed. Richter had tried to burn his, but hadn't been thorough enough. He's communicating with Moscow Center, Kovac confirmed. This is KGB's standard procedure. The discovery transformed the investigation. If Richter was using one-time pads, he was receiving instructions directly from Soviet intelligence headquarters in Moscow. That meant dead drops, prearranged signals, and a level of operational sophistication that went beyond simple eavesdropping. Hartley requested authorization for electronic surveillance of Richter's apartment. The request went through multiple levels of approval, wiretapping an American citizen, even a suspected spy, required legal justification and oversight. But given Richter's access to classified material and the evidence already gathered, the authorization came through. The FBI's Technical Services Division installed listening devices in Richter's apartment during one of his workdays. Microphones were placed in the telephone, the living room lamp, and the bedroom. A separate team installed a camera in a surveillance post across the street, providing visual coverage of Richter's front door and windows. For days, the surveillance yielded nothing. Richter came home, ate dinner, watched television, and went to bed. He made no phone calls, received no visitors. The apartment was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of traffic from the street below. Then, on a Tuesday evening in late April, Richter deviated from his routine. He left his apartment at 8:47 p.m., carrying a small canvas bag. The surveillance team followed him as he drove south toward Washington, using standard counter-surveillance techniques, frequent lane changes, abrupt turns, stops to check for tails. He was good, but the FBI team was better. They used multiple vehicles, rotating positions to avoid detection. Richter parked near Rock Creek Park and walked into the woods along a poorly lit trail. The FBI agents followed on foot, maintaining distance, using night vision equipment to track his movements. Hartley watched from a command vehicle parked on a nearby street, listening to updates over the radio. Subject is stopped near a large oak tree, approximately 50 meters north of the trail. He's examining the base of the tree. A dead drop, the classic espionage technique. One agent leaves material at a prearranged location. Another retrieves it later. No direct contact, no risk of surveillance catching both parties together. Is he loading or retrieving? Hartley asked. Loading. He's placing something in a cavity in the tree trunk, now covering it with bark. He's moving away. The team allowed Richter to leave, then moved in to examine the drop site. Inside the cavity, wrapped in plastic, was a sealed envelope containing 3 items: a microfilm canister, a type report on NSA decryption progress against Soviet naval codes, and a request for payment, $5,000, to be delivered at a separate location. The microfilm contained photographs of classified documents that Richter had smuggled out of Fort Meade. Page after page of technical intelligence, code sequences, radio frequencies, intercept summaries. Each frame represented a violation of the Espionage Act and a gift to Soviet intelligence. Hartley held the canister up to the light, his jaw tight. How much has he given them? The question haunted the investigation. To arrest Richter immediately would stop the bleeding, but it would also alert the Soviets that their operation had been compromised. The FBI wanted to roll up the entire network, identify Richter's handlers, document the full extent of the damage, and possibly feed disinformation back through the channel. But that required keeping Richter in play. And that meant risk. The decision was made at the highest levels. Richter would remain under surveillance, but the FBI would replace his dead drop material with carefully prepared intelligence, real enough to seem authentic, but sanitized to prevent genuine harm. The goal was to make Moscow Center believe the operation was still secure, while the FBI mapped the entire espionage network. Over the following weeks, the FBI documented 5 more dead drops, each one meticulously photographed and analyzed. Richter's Soviet handlers never appeared in person. They used cutouts, intermediaries who retrieved the material and passed it along the chain. The FBI identified 3 such couriers, all of them operating undercover as students or low-level embassy staff. But the investigation kept circling back to the Bible. Why had Petrov used such an unusual method? Subminiature microphones were common in Soviet espionage, but hiding one inside a religious text and moving it from location to location was operationally risky. It required precision, planning, and a psychological understanding of American culture. Hartley began to suspect that the Bible was more than just a listening device. It was a message, a deliberate provocation designed to manipulate whoever found it. Think about it, he said to Lamphere during one of their late-night strategy sessions. If we'd found the Bible but not identified Richter, what would we have concluded? Lamphere considered the question, that the Soviets were targeting religious institutions, churches, refugee organizations. We'd have increased security around those areas, diverted resources. Exactly. The Bible wasn't just collecting intelligence. It was shaping our response, making us look in the wrong direction while Richter kept feeding them information from NSA. It was a sophisticated psychological operation, layered and deceptive, and it suggested that someone in Soviet intelligence understood American counterintelligence procedures well enough to anticipate them. They have another source, Hartley said quietly. Someone inside the Bureau or NSA who's telling them how we operate. The possibility was chilling. 1 mole was catastrophic. 2 would be a disaster that could compromise the entire intelligence community. The investigation expanded. Security reviews, polygraph examinations, intense scrutiny of anyone who'd had contact with information related to the Richter case. The atmosphere inside the FBI became tense, almost paranoid. Every colleague a potential suspect, every conversation potentially monitored. And then, in early May, Richter disappeared. Paul Richter was arrested on May 8th, 1963, at 6:15 a.m., as he arrived for his shift at Fort Meade. FBI agents blocked his car in the parking lot, weapons drawn, and ordered him to step out with his hands visible. Richter complied without resistance, his face showing neither surprise nor fear, only a kind of weary resignation, as if he'd been expecting this moment for years. He was transported to a secure FBI facility at Quantico, Virginia, where high-value subjects were interrogated away from public scrutiny. The facility was designed for long-term questioning, comfortable enough to avoid claims of coercion, but isolated enough to apply psychological pressure. Richter was placed in a windowless room with a table, 2 chairs, and a recording device mounted on the wall. Hartley entered the room at 9 a.m. He carried a thick folder containing surveillance photographs, transcripts, and copies of the documents recovered from the dead drops. He sat across from Richter and placed a folder on the table between them. You know why you're here, Hartley said. Richter nodded slowly. He looked older than his 47 years, his face lined with exhaustion. I assume you found the drops. All of them. We've been watching you for 2 months, Mr. Richter. We have photographs, recordings, physical evidence. We know about your contact with Viktor Petrov. We know about the Bible. We know you've been passing classified intelligence to the Soviet Union for at least 3 years. Richter said nothing. His hands rested on the table, fingers interlaced, steady. Here's what happens next, Hartley continued. You're going to be charged under the Espionage Act. The evidence against you is overwhelming. You'll be convicted, and you'll spend the rest of your life in federal prison. That's certain. He opened the folder and slid a photograph across the table. It showed Richter placing the envelope in the tree cavity at Rock Creek Park. The image captured with perfect clarity. But there's another possibility, Hartley said. You cooperate. You tell us everything. Why you did this, who recruited you, what information you passed, what other operations you know about. If you do that, the government might show leniency, not freedom, but perhaps something less than a life sentence. Richter studied the photograph for a long moment, then looked up. You want me to betray them the way I betrayed you. I want you to tell the truth. The truth? Richter smiled faintly, bitterly. The truth is that I stopped believing in this country a long time ago. Over the next 6 hours, Richter told his story. He'd been recruited in 1960, 3 years earlier, during a routine trip to New York City. He'd gone to visit his sister, who lived in Brooklyn, and had stopped at a bookstore in Manhattan. A man had approached him, middle-aged, well-dressed, speaking with a faint Eastern European accent. They'd struck up a conversation about history, about the war, about the moral compromises required by the Cold War. He knew things about me, Richter said, personal things. He knew I'd been passed over for promotion twice at NSA. He knew I'd been questioned during a security review because my father had been a member of the German-American Bund before the war. He knew I felt used, like I'd given everything to this country and gotten nothing back. The man, later identified as a KGB officer operating under deep cover, had been patient. No immediate recruitment pitch, no crude appeals to ideology or money, just conversation, sympathy, a suggestion that perhaps Paul Richter deserved better than what America had given him. They'd met again a month later. This time, the conversation had turned more direct. The Soviet Union valued men like Richter, skilled, underappreciated, capable of seeing beyond propaganda. If he were willing to share information, he would be compensated. Not just money, but recognition, a place in history, as someone who'd worked for peace by ensuring neither side had an insurmountable advantage. They made it sound noble, Richter said, like I'd be preventing war, not enabling it. The rationalization was common among Cold War traders, the belief that espionage somehow balanced the scales between superpowers, making nuclear conflict less likely. It was a self-serving delusion, but one that allowed men like Richter to sleep at night. The first documents he'd passed were minor, technical reports on signal processing, nothing that would immediately compromise operations. But the KGB had been methodical, gradually increasing their requests, building dependence through regular payments and carefully applied praise. By 1962, Richter was providing detailed intelligence on NSA's most sensitive programs. What about the Bible? Hartley asked. Whose idea was that? Richter hesitated. Petrov's. He said it was a test, proof that the KGB could operate anywhere, even in places Americans considered sacred. He wanted to see if we'd find it, and if we did, whether we'd understand what it meant. Which was that the Cold War isn't just about missiles and spies. It's about ideas, symbols. The Bible was a way of saying that nothing is safe from infiltration, not even faith. Hartley felt a chill. The psychological sophistication of the operation was disturbing. The KGB hadn't just planted a listening device. They planted a weapon designed to undermine American confidence in its own institutions. How many other sources does Petrov have? Hartley asked. I don't know. We never met directly. Everything went through dead drops or intermediaries. But you suspected others. Richter nodded. There were references in the instructions I received, mentions of parallel sources and overlapping coverage. They were getting information from multiple places. I was just one piece of a larger network that confirmed Hartley's fears. Richter wasn't an isolated case. He was part of a systematic Soviet penetration of American intelligence agencies. Did they ever mention anyone by name? Anyone inside the FBI or CIA? Richter shook his head. No names, but they knew things they shouldn't have known. Details about FBI surveillance techniques. Specifics about counterintelligence operations against Soviet diplomats. Someone was feeding them information about how we operate. The interrogation continued for 3 days. Richter provided names, dates, locations, everything he could remember about his 3 years as a Soviet asset. The FBI cross-referenced his testimony with existing intelligence, looking for patterns, connections, leads to other compromised individuals. But one question remained unanswered. Why had Richter disappeared on May 7th, the day before his arrest? During a break in the interrogation, Hartley reviewed the surveillance logs from that final day. Richter had left work early, claiming illness. He'd driven to a bank in Baltimore and withdrawn $5,000 in cash, nearly his entire savings. Then he'd driven to Washington National Airport. The FBI had intercepted him there, watching as he purchased a one-way ticket to Mexico City under a false name. He'd been planning to defect. When Hartley confronted him with this, Richter's composure finally broke. "They burned me," he said, his voice shaking. Petrov sent a message through the usual channel. It said the operation was compromised, and I needed to exfiltrate immediately. They were supposed to have someone waiting in Mexico City to get me to Cuba, then to Moscow. But you didn't go. I got to the airport and realized I couldn't do it. I couldn't leave. This is my country, even if I betrayed it, even if I hate what it's become. He looked at Hartley with something close to desperation. I wanted to disappear, but I couldn't be Russian. I could never be Russian. It was a contradiction at the heart of many Cold War traitors, the simultaneous desire to reject their country and the inability to fully abandon it. Richter had committed espionage, but when faced with the final step of defection, he'd hesitated. That hesitation had led to his capture, but it also meant that the Soviets knew the operation was compromised before the FBI had arrested Richter. Someone had warned them. Who told Petrov? Hartley demanded. Who warned him that we were closing in? I don't know, Richter said. But whoever it is, they're still out there. And they're closer to you than you think. The arrest of Paul Richter should have been a victory for the FBI. But instead it felt like the opening of a deeper, more dangerous investigation. Richter's confession had provided valuable intelligence, details of Soviet tradecraft, insights into KGB recruitment strategies, evidence of a broader espionage network. But the most disturbing revelation was the one Hartley kept returning to. Someone had warned the Soviets before the FBI could complete its operation. That warning had come through official channels, reaching Petrov in time for him to alert Richter to flee, which meant the source had access to FBI operational plans. High-level access. Hartley stood in the FBI's counterintelligence war room, staring at a wall covered with photographs, organizational charts, and timelines. The investigation had expanded to include every individual who'd had knowledge of the Richter case: agents, analysts, supervisors, technical specialists. Each one had been subjected to intensive scrutiny, background checks, financial audits, polygraph examinations, surveillance. So far, nothing. It's like chasing smoke, Lamphere said, standing beside Hartley. The veteran agent looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. Whoever this is, they're disciplined. No unusual contacts, no financial red flags, no behavioral changes. Either they're incredibly good, or we're looking in the wrong place. We're not looking in the wrong place, Hartley said. The leak came from inside the bureau. That's the only explanation for how Petrov knew. Then maybe it's not a person. Maybe it's a procedure, a weakness in how we compartmentalize information. Hartley considered that. Counterintelligence operations require coordination between multiple divisions, surveillance teams, technical specialists, legal advisors, case officers. Each division maintained its own files, its own communication channels. if information from one division was leaking into another without proper controls. An attentive observer could piece together enough to understand the scope of an investigation. But that didn't explain the timing. Petrov had warned Richter with precision, not too early, which might have seemed like paranoia, but exactly when the FBI was preparing to make its move. That suggested someone with direct knowledge of the arrest timeline. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction: Viktor Petrov himself. In the weeks following Richter's arrest, the FBI maintained intensive surveillance on Petrov and the other Soviet intelligence officers operating out of the Washington embassy. The goal was to identify anyone Petrov contacted, any dead drops he serviced, any signals that might reveal the broader network. Petrov had become cautious, almost paranoid. He avoided his usual haunts, made no dead drops, met with no one outside official diplomatic functions. But he couldn't remain isolated forever. The KGB needed him active, and eventually he would have to resume operations. On June 18th, FBI surveillance teams observed Petrov entering the Library of Congress. He spent 2 hours in the reading room, apparently researching American history. Agents photographed everyone who entered or left during that time, cross-referencing faces against FBI databases. One face appeared in multiple photographs: a woman in her mid-30s, dark hair, professional attire. She sat 3 tables away from Petrov, reading a book, occasionally making notes. She never approached him, never made eye contact. But 30 minutes after Petrov left the library, she left as well. Facial recognition software identified her as Claire Donovan, a research analyst for the State Department's Soviet Affairs Division. Her security clearance gave her access to diplomatic cables, intelligence assessments, and interagency coordination files. She'd worked for the government for 12 years, first at the CIA's Office of Soviet Analysis, then transferring to state in 1959. Hartley pulled her file immediately. Claire Donovan's background seemed impeccable: bachelor's degree from Georgetown, master's from Columbia, fluent in Russian and Polish, born in Pennsylvania, to a family of Irish immigrants. No foreign travel, except official government trips. No unusual financial activity. No red flags during her last security reinvestigation in 1961. But there was something Hartley noticed. Donovan had been transferred from CIA to State Department just months after a major reorganization of Soviet intelligence operations in Washington. The timing was curious. Run a full background on her, Hartley ordered. Everything. Family, friends, finances, travel history. I want to know every person she's ever talked to. The investigation into Claire Donovan proceeded carefully. The FBI couldn't afford to alert her if she was indeed the leak, but they also couldn't allow her to continue compromising operations. She was placed under constant surveillance. Her phone was tapped, her mail was monitored. For 2 weeks, Donovan's life appeared completely normal. She went to work at the State Department, attended meetings, wrote reports. She had lunch with colleagues, went grocery shopping, visited her elderly mother in Arlington. Nothing suspicious. Then, on a Friday evening in early July, Donovan left her apartment carrying a small leather purse and drove to Georgetown. She parked near the waterfront and walked along the Potomac River, stopping occasionally to watch the boats. The surveillance team followed at a distance, using multiple agents to avoid detection. At precisely 7:30 p.m., Donovan sat on a bench near the river. She opened her purse, removed a book, a paperback novel, and began reading. She remained there for 20 minutes, then stood, placed the book on the bench, and walked away. The FBI team waited. 5 minutes later, a man approached the bench, sat down, picked up the book, and left. The man was not Viktor Petrov. He was younger, athletic, with the bearing of someone trained in military or intelligence work. The FBI followed him to a car, documented the license plate, and began tracking his movements. The car was registered to the Soviet embassy as part of its motor pool. The man was Andrei Volkov, officially listed as a second secretary in the embassy's administrative section. His real role, according to CIA assessments, was KGB Line KR, counterintelligence, responsible for protecting Soviet intelligence operations from Western penetration. The dead drop confirmed what Hartley had suspected. Claire Donovan was the leak. The FBI moved quickly but carefully. Arresting Donovan immediately would reveal to the Soviets that their asset had been compromised, but allowing her to continue operating was unacceptable. The decision was made to replace the contents of the dead drop with carefully prepared material. False intelligence designed to mislead the KGB while the FBI built its case. Simultaneously, a deeper investigation into Donovan's background began. How had she been recruited? How long had she been working for the Soviets? What damage had she done? The answers emerged slowly, through painstaking analysis of her communications, financial records, and movements over the previous 4 years. Donovan had been recruited in 1959, shortly after her transfer to the State Department. The recruitment had occurred during a research trip to Vienna, where she'd attended a conference on Soviet-American relations. A Soviet intelligence officer posing as an academic had befriended her, cultivated a relationship over several months, and eventually made the recruitment pitch. Unlike Richter, Donovan hadn't been motivated by resentment or money. She'd been motivated by ideology. She believed that the United States was the aggressor in the Cold War, that Soviet policies were more just, that nuclear weapons in American hands represented a greater threat to world peace than Soviet expansionism. It was a common profile among Cold War traitors recruited through ideological appeal, educated, well-meaning individuals who convinced themselves that espionage was a form of moral action rather than betrayal. Donovan had been careful, patient, and effective. She'd passed information on FBI and CIA operations against Soviet intelligence officers, warned the KGB about surveillance, and provided details on American negotiating positions during arms control talks. The damage she'd done was significant, though not as catastrophic as Richter's compromise of NSA signals intelligence. But her most important contribution to the KGB had been her warning about the Richter investigation. She'd learned about the operation through an interagency coordination meeting where FBI, CIA, and State Department officials discussed potential Soviet intelligence threats. Donovan had attended that meeting, taken notes, and within 24 hours had passed the information to her Soviet handler. That warning had nearly allowed Richter to escape, and it had demonstrated the vulnerability of American counterintelligence to internal penetration. On July 22, 1963, Claire Donovan was arrested as she arrived for work at the State Department. FBI agents took her into custody without incident. She was driven to the same facility at Quantico, where Richter had been held and interrogated. Unlike Richter, Donovan showed no remorse. "You think you're protecting freedom," she told Hartley during her interrogation. "But you're just protecting an empire. The Soviet Union isn't perfect, but it's trying to build something better than endless competition and the threat of nuclear annihilation." "You put American lives at risk," Hartley replied. "People who trusted you. People who believed you were working for the same goals they were. I am working for peace. You just can't see it." The self-righteousness was maddening, but Hartley had seen it before. Ideology could be a more powerful motivator than money, and more resistant to reason. Donovan genuinely believed she'd been doing the right thing, even as she faced decades in prison for espionage. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when the FBI analyzed the documents Donovan had passed through her dead drops. Among them was a detailed report on FBI technical surveillance capabilities, how bugs were installed, what frequencies were used, how monitoring operations were conducted. That report had been marked with a source code, Bible. The Bible listening device hadn't just been an operation, it had been a test. A way for the KGB to evaluate the FBI's technical capabilities and response procedures. Every action the FBI had taken, the black bag operation, the X-ray analysis, the surveillance of Petrov, had been observed and reported back to Moscow Center through Donovan. The Soviets had been watching the watchers, learning how American counterintelligence operated by studying its response to the very provocation they created. "It was a training exercise," Hartley said to Lanphier after reviewing the evidence. "They planted the Bible to see how we'd react. And Donovan told them everything we did." "Which means they'll adapt," Lanphier replied. "Next time, they'll use different methods, different technology. They'll stay ahead of us because they know how we think." It was a fundamental paradox of counterintelligence. Every success revealed methods, and revealed methods became obsolete. The Cold War was an endless cycle of innovation and counterinnovation, penetration and counterpenetration, with each side trying to stay one step ahead of the other. Paul Richter and Claire Donovan were both convicted of espionage and sentenced to long prison terms. Viktor Petrov was declared persona non grata and expelled from the United States. Andrei Volkov and several other Soviet intelligence officers were quietly asked to leave the country, but the Bible itself, the listening device that had started the entire investigation, was never returned to the Soviets. It remained in FBI custody, preserved as evidence and as a reminder. Hartley visited the FBI's technical laboratory months after the case had been closed. The Bible sat in a glass case, its leather cover worn, its pages yellowed. The device had been removed, but the hollow cavity remained visible, a small, precise cut in the spine where technology and scripture had been merged into an instrument of espionage. Do you think it was worth it? Kovac asked, standing beside Hartley. All the work, the surveillance, the risk. We caught 2 spies, but there are probably a dozen more we haven't found. Hartley studied the Bible in silence. It's worth it because we can't afford to stop. The moment we stop looking, the moment we accept that some things are too sacred or too difficult to examine, that's when we lose. He thought about the chaplain's quarters at Fort Meade, where the Bible had briefly been left, hoping to catch conversations between military personnel and religious counselors. He thought about the Refugee Assistance Office, where people fleeing Soviet oppression had spoken freely, believing they were safe. He thought about the congressional offices and the university libraries, all the places where Americans had assumed that privacy and trust still meant something. The Cold War had turned everything into potential weapon, even faith, even symbols of peace. And the only defense was eternal vigilance. Even when that vigilance felt exhausting, even when it required suspicion of colleagues and friends. Yeah, Hartley said quietly. It was worth it. He turned away from the case and walked out of the laboratory, back into the world of shadows and secrets, where the next operation was already beginning and the next threat was already taking shape. The Cold War wasn't a single conflict. It was 1,000 small battles fought in silence, in darkness, between people who believed they were protecting something larger than themselves, even when they couldn't agree on what that something was. And somewhere in Moscow, in a secure room deep inside KGB headquarters, another operation was being planned. Another device was being designed. Another target was being selected. The silent war continued.